good evening and welcome to this evening's ASEN event with Billy Zacroni, and I'll apologise now for not getting the pronunciation right because every time I do this I seem to get it wrong. We're going to be talking about Billy's new book, Radicalisation and Crisis Management, Shifts of Radical Right Discourse. They are Senior Assistant Professor of Comparative Politics at the Institute of Political Science. And because clearly they wanted a quiet life, they research far-right parties, radicalisation, crisis, and aren't we all glad that that is not at all relevant to today's world? More seriously, welcome, Billy. Just before we start, an announcement from ASEN, which is of course the call for papers for our annual conference is out at the moment. Just go to our website, asen.ac.uk, or any of our socials. All the information is there. The call for papers is open until the 5th of December. The subject is nationalism, democracy and freedom, and it will be taking place from the 21st to the 23rd of April 2026 at the University of Edinburgh. So, without further ado, let's go over to Billy. And I should say at the start, if you've got any questions, if you're watching on Zoom or on Facebook or on YouTube, put them in the chat on whichever platform you're on, and I'll ask them of Billy at the end. So, without further ado, Billy, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Actually, it was a very good pronunciation, so you should feel proud of yourself in terms of that.
If Aristopoli.
There.
I should say Billy knows my doctoral supervisor, Sophia Vassilopoulou. So I've just got a few words between talking to Sophia and travelling to Greece. So first off, congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Very much enjoyed reading it, and as I was saying before, unfortunately highly relevant. I mean that in the kindest possible way, but I think it is relevant to where we are in the world at the moment. I'm going to start, if I may, with our traditional three questions.
Okay.
So, first question: who is your favourite author on nationalism? What's your favourite book on nationalism studies?
Yeah, I think it's just like it is a rather difficult question to answer, right? It's not a difficult question, but actually, how can you select that? Luckily, I do have a course running this period that will talk about these matters on nationalism. And remind me, I think I always appreciated Billing's book, Ballad Nationalism, because it provides, for those that we don't know, it's just like he's a social psychologist. So it provides a quite different approach on studying nationalism and taking it a little bit further, saying that actually nationalism is established in modern societies, not like the normal version that you're used to, like the hot kind of display, waving flags or going to war, but rather in a much more subtle way, through everyday practices, right? So it's more about how we understand that actually this takes this kind of content in a little bit of more permanent, but let's be a little bit unconscious of the background form of expressing nationalism in practices that we don't actually consider that are taking place. From a way that actually you pass by, I live in The Hague, I pass by every day a government building and the flag is there. Right? You don't notice it, but the flag is actually there, right? Or the way that actually on the routines, expressions that we might have through the language or through the practices that actually are carried out through our culture as well, that is highly, I'm Greek, for us it's a very direct actually reference to make, right? Or then afterwards it has to do about, we're going to talk about the book, but it's all about the discourse. So he talks about how basically we build this kind of discourse to refer to us or to we through the media, or it's just like, again, as I said, to this kind of routine and mundane practices that we have every day. And what I like about this book, it's actually that it takes a little bit away that kind of, again, focus about nationalism is something bad and something negative. Don't get me wrong, it is, right? joke, but it takes away that kind of hot, as he called it, or it's just like exotic. I think it's one of the words that he's using, and bringing it to a different kind of understanding. Having said that, it does highlight about how close it can, this kind of banal and mundane form of nationalism can shift and radicalize and turns to the extreme. So it's not that this kind of, it's a passive way, but actually it is. It forms this kind of base of a nationalism that actually in a specific circumstance can turn into this kind of negative form that we are used to talk about. So it will be Billy.
Super choice. I mean, it's a wonderful book, and the theory I think has it's so popular because it is so powerful. I was just thinking, if you walk down the high street in the town where I live, you've got the town hall, which has actually has three flags, three Union flags on it, and then on the other side of the market square, there's a Church of England, so it's got the St George's Cross flying. If you go into the town hall, there's a picture of the king. So it's but it's everywhere, and you see it in everywhere you're going. I mean, I think one of the examples, the on the post box you have the royal seal and so on.
Sorry, I interrupted you. It's exactly that, right? And I think it's just like there is this kind of tendency, at least for the very traditional, when we talk about nationalism theories, the very traditional, structural, functioning form that actually this functional necessity for a state to have nationalism, right? It's just like, again, we mentioned Geller before starting and recording, right? But at least it shifts this kind of, again, to the people, to this kind of routine and more psychological aspect. That it's also on the background, right? It's not on the form, so it's just like what it builds without actually acknowledging that it's there, but how fast we can see it and actually can be motivated, energized, and be a pioneer movement.
But the other thing is Michael Billig. I don't know if you've met him. He's lovely.
I haven't.
He's a really nice man. He spoke at one of our conferences a few years ago, which was fantastic, and because I have to do the money, he was fantastic. He was brilliant. We'll fly people in. He took the bus, which was brilliant, and because he's got a bus pass, we didn't even have to refund him his bus ticket.
Yeah.
So that was great. But on to the second question.
Yes.
What led you to this research?
The research of the book or the research of the far right?
Well, let's do both. Let's start with the far right, and then let's do the book, if you like.
No, of course. I think just we will talk about that. The far right, I think I have a very traditional story, getting inspired by one of my professors when I was doing my bachelor's. When it was first introduced, it was Vasiliki Georgiadou, the name. Again, maybe for the viewers, Greeks really write Radicalisation. They love it. I think that there's so many Greek scholars out there studying it. But at the times, it was one of the few. It was the early 2000s when I entered uni, and I was first exposed to that class, the far right in Western Europe. And then it was, a sequence of events. I did one of the assignments at the time for the course, and then I wanted to learn more, master's and PhD, and that led me to to this path that I am now, right? And I think it's just like what I always find that fascinating, and I still do. That's one of the reasons I keep studying it. That keeps changing, right? It's not something that actually, it has this flexibility that I talk about in the book as well. This kind of flexibility and this kind of adaptivity that we don't see in the rest of the political families, but actually it is quite there when we talk about the far right or the radical right. And of course, you have to learn the enemy from within. That's the only way to protect the world and democracy. Yeah. So, of course, it's just like this more idealistic part that, of course, drives me as a researcher. But that was it. I think it was like that. And also this kind of variety from country to country that we don't see that often again in the rest of the political family. So this what drove me, and understanding also the message. I think one of it takes me out again to the fundamentals of education. First of all, it's just like we're educated democracy. What is the best way to protect it? It's through education, but also knowing and understanding what is it that we're talking about. So this is what I'm there. In terms of the book, I think just continuing my path. So let's say in my master thesis 20 years ago, actually, it was 2005. It was on a lot about electoral success. And then my interest was shifting, right? Because, okay, it's just like when I was thinking about the PhD, in the end, I ended up talking about political marketing and branding and how basically they run electoral campaigns. So I was really fascinated about that, the message, what did they do with the message? And through, it happened to work on a paper a couple of years ago, and I was introduced for the first time to crisis management theories. And this is actually where it's coming from. I think it's just like, again, trying to find this kind of stimulating new interest. And I am fascinated by crisis management theories. And this is where actually it's coming from. I think it's just I think it's just like when you, as a political scientist, because crisis management, it's a lot about, I think I will come afterwards to that. It's about finding solutions in the end of the day. So it's a lot about public administration and policy making. But we tend to forget that actually it doesn't mean that actually other political parties, you don't have to be a government in order to use crisis management, right? It has to do about how, in the end of the day, just like what we see, crisis, even when we look at the crisis itself, it's socially constructed. And if we look at the discourse of parties, they claim for crisis when actually we cannot even observe it outside, right? So therefore, it's just like, okay, and we know that. We know if we look at the radical right, and if you're familiar with the discourse of radical right, it's crisis everywhere. Therefore, I was like, okay, if they claim for crisis, maybe crisis management theories make a little bit sense. And then I try to zoom in a little bit, and because crisis management have different kind of tiers, let's say, and steps. So what interested me more, and what I have been talking and ranting about, it's what meaning do they make? What is crisis for radical right? I called it far right in the beginning. I'm not consistent in the terminology I'm using through this call. But yeah, so it's just what meaning do they give to the crisis? Yeah. So I think it's just what meaning do we give generally? I think it's like that. That strikes me. This kind of social construction that we add to things, and crisis provides that, of course, on the background of what crisis do to political parties.
I mean, in this one words, I hadn't come across the literature on crisis management at all before I read your book. So, okay. so super interesting and new to me, but sort of got the relevance of it. And actually, I think there's something really quite there's something really quite powerful there in understanding it. But this moves on to the third question.
Yeah. What's
the argument of your book?
Yes. So that was a little bit of an introduction about what it is about. And as I said, right, and where I'm coming from as well, we tend to focus a lot about, okay, if you look at the literature, that there is a crisis and suddenly there is a peak of the radical right. But it doesn't come out of completely anywhere. And also we see this kind of, again, throughout the years, I think in the early 2000s, back then when I started studying, it was like, there is this phenomenon. Now there is not phenomenon. It's actually the consistency, presence, and consistent sentiment that draws people to support these kind of parties. So from one, you have that, and you don't just have the crisis on its own to stand alone, to excuse this kind of persistence of radical right parties in the political scenes. So that's one. And the other is just actually, having said that, we cannot minimize the effect of crisis on, as they say, opening the window of opportunities to parties, right? And this kind of window of opportunity, it's what lays on this kind, how can we exploit crisis? So how parties exploit crisis? And this is basically just the book is dealing with. Because what it does, it's just like what the radical right, like, are you going to tell me other parties do not do it, they do it. But we're interested in radical right,
Yeah,
right?
of
This is
course.
the important, but just for
Yeah, no,
because
no.
if it's just radical right, of course it's not. But what they do is just like, again, strategically shift the narrative and reframe the narrative around the crisis that actually is happening. So it's just, and what I said before, it's just like this kind of flexibility and this kind of different kind of ability that radical right parties have, even structurally, provides them to reframe it in a way that actually they have even a broader audience and they can reach even more, again, a larger part of the electorate, if you like. Therefore, in order to understand that, we need to look at, again, to understand okay, they succeed. But why they succeed is actually, we need to look a little bit more about how do they frame it, how do they construct it from the beginning, how do they narrate and use it for their benefit and for their own cause. So it's just like, it's not a chance. It's just like that happens out of nowhere, right? It doesn't just benefit out of chance, the radical right. Actually, they use it and utilize it. And this is how actually the book draws that attention. So actively using the crisis for the benefit of and reshaping the political debate around them. What it draws the book, for those who are not familiar with, it's a comparative in different kind of cases, and actually it studies different kind of countries, and it does cover 4 different crises. So what I wanted to do was a cross-country and a cross-crisis comparative and cross-time, so cross-country, cross-time, and cross-crisis comparative, in order to see if we can identify, of course, if it's a comparative study. I do now intro to comparative politics, so it's all about what is the design. So in order to see about, again, if we can draw this kind of different kind of, if we can see and identify different kind of patterns. Because again, here we have to remember what the crisis, I'm emphasizing a little bit, because I think it's fundamental, again, to understand the role of the crisis in that. Because it's just like, it's a competition of narratives in the end of the day. If we see, it's the way we see political competition, generally it can take different kind of forms. But if we talk about political discourse, it's how you narrate and interpret of what actually what's happening and what actually narrative dominates in the specific time. And the other part, it's just like provides legitimacy. And again, I'm talking about, because we're talking about radical right, it's not parties that actually participate or are governing, but nevertheless, it provides this kind of a layer of legitimacy, even for even in the political competition, if you like, right, or opposition. And the last part, it sets the ground for a debate for the future, but also it can cancel of actually, narratives that have happened in the past or reinvent them, if you like. Because again, it has to do about how you construct it. So to answer the question, long story short, give the platform to an academic and they will make a whole thing about it. So I think it draws 5 main conclusions as part of the argument. And I think it's just like one of the things that I found quite let's say interesting, I think for me, at least, what I was unexpected, it's just like they really stick very close to their ideology. I'm talking about reframing, so it's just like I took a pause there. I talk about reframing, but at the end of the day, if we look at the fundamental elements of the radical right ideology, they're all there every single time. It just shifts depending on the specific crisis that they're talking about. So for instance, it's just like if we're talking about the economic crisis, it's just like the focus would be more about how the EU and globalization led the country to these terrible laws that the country is going through. And then if we were thinking about migration, these are crises that the book covers. It's all about securitization, and again, how the EU basically just like failed to support different kind of the member states. But it's all about security, it's about sovereignty as well, and how we can protect that. And this is an argument that actually leans to the next, because I'm talking about Brexit and this kind of crisis that created within the European Union, shifting a little bit more towards the nationalism and sovereignty of the national identity. And then COVID, it provides this kind of space talking about civil liberties that actually were not quite used from the radical right to bring along. Nevertheless, it's just like it's still close to using this kind of mistrust towards the government, towards the elite, towards the experts, still making it more about and referring it closer to their ideological platform. So again, we see this kind of consistency, which I think its core takes back to this kind of adaptivity that I said. It's just like this kind of, descriptive, sorry about my English, adaptivity, that it's anchored to this ideological stability that the radical right has, which is actually fundamental at the end. And that takes you generally to the debate about how close, if ideology still plays a role. I think it's just like, again, in political science, does ideology matter? And if we look at least, again, in the spectrum of more than a decade that I cover, ideology does matter, and they don't divert, which I think on its own, it's very interesting about not falling into, stick to your guns and you still get the support that you need or even more. The other part is actually, again, it creates this kind of platform about that if we look at the literature, maybe there is this kind of claims that actually crisis benefits the radical right. This is not always the case. It depends on the crisis, and the success varies, and what we mean by success as well. I think here it's just like, it's generally we have to think about, are we looking about electoral success, or are we looking about the impact that it might have on the political debate, which is essential on parties, and especially radical right parties, and how they affect the political scenes. So what we see, just like we see that actually if we look at just on the economic crisis, it didn't affect and it didn't benefit all the radical right parties across Europe. It's just like, again, we see mixed electoral support. If we look closer about the EU, and when we talk about Brexit, we don't see an effect when it comes to electoral performances, but more about how they're reshifting their own narrative from a little bit more hard Euroscepticism and discussions about leaving the European Union to a more moderate Euroscepticism. So it's not electoral, but it is political discourse effect. Or if we look a little bit more about COVID, it was very difficult to actually affect them electorally. We cannot say that actually COVID benefited the radical right. So again, it's just like there is not a consistent electoral gain, and there is not specific, let's say, formula that we can apply. So opportunities, arise, but opportunities are uneven, and success varies. So it's just like, again, and it has to do about, let's say, maybe if a radical right party is close to the government. So it's just like the proximity to the government, of course it's going to affect you when it comes to crisis and crisis management. And if you want to look at about, again, this kind of different kind of electoral results that you might have. Or might resonate the whole debate about the ownership of the crisis. About, again, claim it or existing, or what you make out of it, right? And another thing is the crisis itself. So the theories of the crisis creates a very specific environment of uncertainty, of fear, and urgency. So that affects as well about how this is going to be reflected on the electoral result. So we cannot forget that actually we're talking about a very special circumstance or very specific environment, a crisis environment, and I'm sure if we have colleagues in crisis, going to tell me, wait a minute, there are many different kind of forms that we can know about crisis, but this is it. And I think it's just like two more. One is the patterns that we, if we look at the book, are identified. So from the beginning about who, first of all, defined the crisis, and who is responsible about the crisis, then about, so therefore it's just like the attribution of blame. When it comes to crisis, someone is to be blamed. So it's just like identify who is actually to be blamed and attribute the blame, then highlight the risks that are under that, it's just like, and the impact in the society that a crisis imposes, and then present the argument of exiting the crisis and shift it more to about whether it's going to be talking about present nationalism or talking about protectivist solutions that are very close to the far right, radical right ideology. So that's the fourth one. Lost count of the third one. Either way, the one before the last, because the last one, it has to do about, again, reflect the intensity and the local statistics of the crisis. And we see that the simplest examples that we see is when we look about migration crisis. And if we look at the debate between Greece and Italy, and what's happening in the other countries, because of course it's very different of how it's affected, right? Because for the migration crisis, in the case like Greece and Italy, it's more survival, right? So it's just like there is much more this kind of urgency in the political discourse that we see, rather than actually a little bit more abstract and a little bit more micro-level narratives that we see from the parties in a different kind of, in a more Western European countries, right? A little bit more milder discourse, a little bit more structured discourse than the sentimental ranged discourse that we see from Greece and Italy that are hosting countries, and not hosting, sorry, countries where actually they received the refugees in the refugees flow. So that, and the other part is that actually we see, especially in the COVID situation, that we see this kind of awareness of crisis management. If we look at the cases of Austria and Finland, for instance, we see the parties using crisis management language and vocabulary as part of their discourse. So it provides a little bit of more technocratic, let's say, layer for these parties that shifts from the opportunity to a more structural, again, a strategic way to use crisis and provide solutions and bring this kind of legitimacy to your discourse as well, having that kind of awareness. So, long story short, my argument, or at least my argument, but at least my findings and what the claims I'm trying to make, it's actually this kind of reaffirming, if you like, ideological worldview, this kind of mobilization of the fear of uncertainty and urgency that crisis basically entails, and provide this kind of credibility and this kind of legitimacy as a legitimate, again, it's just like and consistent power fighter. Oh, it's not a fighter, but seeking the power. I'm so sorry. It's just like, so it's just like this kind of agility and flexibility to reframe and exploit crisis itself.
I mean, that was a tour de force.
Sorry,
no,
five things.
No, tour de force. No, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's meant as a compliment. No, it's remarkable to hold that. No, it's fantastic. I mean, there's lots there, and I've got some. I want to ask a methodological question or talk about that because there's some really interesting stuff there. But I want to start with the idea of a crisis itself, and this is partly. This my own ignorance. Is the crisis the objective thing? There is a microorganism called COVID, or is it the discourse?
Right. So I think the way the approach I am using is that crisis is socially constructed. So the moment you claim it, it exists. This is what the theory says, right? It doesn't come from me, not my claims. But the theory says that actually the moment you claim it, it exists. Therefore, you cannot, whether it's there or not, right? And I think it's one of the useful, for me, maybe, just like examples to think about when it helps me here. It's just like thinking about migration. And looking back in the early 90s, when migration becomes a topic, in Scandinavia, for instance, right? New Democracy, and in 1991, let's say. And then if you look at the numbers, well, the party claims, doesn't matter, it's just like anywhere that you look in the 90s, because this is the moment that actually migration becomes a topic from the far right, radical right, sorry. And then it's just like, okay, but then if you look at the numbers, there's not that many migrants, but it's a crisis. So it's just like, was it an issue or was it created? And I'm not saying they created, right? But nevertheless, I think it falls generally to my broader interest when it comes to crisis and political discourse. So it's just like you claim it and it exists. But then it has to do about, it's not just being an isolated political actor that claims and therefore it exists crisis. It does something to the rest of the political discourse. And one of the general questions that have been raised, or at least I'm really interested to explore, that it hasn't been explored yet, when you're a radical right or in the opposition, I think it applies to populists as well. You have nothing to lose because you're in an opposition claiming crisis all over the place. You're not a governing that actually you have to deliver solutions and you have to react. Just like, so you have much less to lose rather than actually being the leading party in the government. Having said that, we see quite often, and it's part of the impact of radical right, how it affects the political debate and the political decisions. So what if we apply that generally to crisis? What happens about how do mainstream parties or established parties, the rest of the parties actually react to claims of crisis from these parties, for instance? This is what interested me, right? Do they adapt the narrative around it? Do they neglect it completely and say this is not happening? Or do they just ignore it like it's not part of the situation, right? So it's not about, it's this kind of connections that political discourse creates and the effect that it has. As I said, it's competing narratives. And crisis provides that, because again, it's just like it has this kind of urgency as well and a little bit more sentimental aspect to it. So to answer your question in terms of that, it's just like it exists, but it impacts as well. It exists the moment it's claimed, and it impacts the way it's adopted by other parties. So this kind of sequence.
So I'm going to do something slightly strange and compare you to Donald Rumsfeld. I don't know if you remember, he had that celebrated quote line about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown knowns. I wonder if that means that there are potential crises out there. There are potential problems that are actual, public policy challenges, but haven't been attached to crisis, and have the potential. There's when if people became aware of them, could become a huge issue. I mean, I'm just saying about the migration into Scandinavia. I'm thinking of it in the context of the UK, where I am, where if you read the press, migration, irregular migration across the Channel is an existential threat. And I just pulled up the figure, slightly less than 37,000. We're a country of 68 million.
Yeah.
In the absolute number doesn't matter, but it is crisisified, if I can make that up. And at the same time, there are public policy issues or potential things that aren't picked up on. There was something there, if I may, that you mentioned, which I'm going to jump around a bit. How do far right, radical right, choose your term parties change as they go from opposition to part of government? Do they still use the same tactics? And this is a slightly strange question, but they keep changing in the same way. They have this sort of smoky thing that they can change and fill whatever space they need to. Do they keep doing that, or do they run into how do they adapt, if at all, to the realities of government?
Yeah. No, this is a great question, right? And I think it's, we mentioned it a little bit before about the whole debate about responsive versus representative government. What happens if actually when you do have a lot to lose, when you become government, right? The majority of the cases that we have seen of radical right parties, usually it's supporting government rather than leading governments, right? And again, I think it's just like what I mentioned before. It's that we don't see that many changes when it comes to their ideology. And it's to this kind of compromise of toning down, let's say, the main argument. Generally, of course, there is a reason about even we in this discussion, far, radical, extreme. So it's just like throughout the years, the terminology has changed exactly because we see this kind of a little bit more toning down from the far to the radical, toning down the narrative in order, of course, to become more appealing and have a little bit more legitimacy as a competing actor for the power, right? So it's just like you cannot minimize that kind of effect that it has throughout the years. So it's just like from the extreme, again, we don't use extreme anymore unless well, at least for the parties that actually participate in elections and parliaments, right? So generally, they stick quite close to their ideology, even when they make it government as supporting parties for the governments. The impact comes either way because it just there is two layers of communication, simplistically. There is the layer of communication that goes through the official channels from the parliament, and if they participate in the government, but also the different kind of narrative that they have for their own party members, right? And I think it's just like this is, if we look at, that they remain very close to their original ideas and their original stances and policies, just like their political, more official, again, just like parliament and government, it comes a little bit more softer. But that's the reason we always have to go to the origins of their official material and when they are addressing their own audience to see if it actually tones down. It's not just a manifesto that we look at. So, but if we look at it on discourse towards their own voters, they became quite strict and close to what they are.
And this is in the parliamentary debates and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut across.
No.
So I mean, the thing is, this is. It's interesting that you've got that. I mean, without wanting to get into is there a far right party family? The ideological consistency surprised me. I thought that there would be more adaptation or more change over time. As a way of accommodating, and but you're finding that doesn't happen. Is interesting, and not what I would have expected. There's surely though there has to be a tension there. I mean, there's always a tension between the ideology or the ideology a party has and the program it has. Given changing circumstances, what the problems are, how votes are going, and so on. Was there any sort of flex at all, or is it actually they've got a pretty solid core ideology, and they just present that, they point that at whatever the crisis of the day is, rather than trying to provide something, I don't know, more palatable.
Yeah, no. The only thing that changes, it's let's say the only thing that shifts, at least again from my findings, right? What it shifts, it's where they put the specific focus on, but all the elements actually remain the same. Here, for maybe for clarity for people that haven't read the book or not familiar with, I looked at parliamentary debates. So here it was like it's not what I looked at specifically as part of the data, right? That's the reason I'm just emphasizing that if we look at different kind of forms of data, we might see a little bit or something else. Not something else from my findings, but I'm just saying for transparency, I looked at my parliamentary debates. What shifts, again, they create the context of the crisis to put a specific focus. For instance, of course, migration. It is that the migration crisis was like a party for them, because migration has been a core part from calling them one single issue parties in the beginning of the 2000s. It's just like, okay, you have a migration crisis and a refugee crisis that are happening. Of course, you're gonna, it takes you back. Migration is gonna be on the peak of your narrative at the point, because this is what actually is happening. We're actually, again, so this is how they use migrants. But again, migration has to do about securitization. It's just like about the borders, of how to protect, about the economy and what kind, if it took a hit it took. It has to do about law and order and how much we have we need to protect from the crimes that are happening from the migrants. But we also have to protect our borders. So and of course, it has to do about the European Union, that all these policies that this is where they left us, because their policies on migration has left us completely unexposed to this crisis, but also they use this kind of, or how ineffective the European Union has been to target previous crises that have been happening. So again, we see this kind of elements from their ideology. I think what surprised me as well, what I was thinking when I was starting the book, was like, okay, what do I do? Do I have to talk about radical right and their ideology? How much theory do I have to bring along, right? And then I decided to go, I was talking to a colleague, parenthesis here, and I was like, oh my God, I'm reading my book. Not I keep reading my book, but I'm like, it reads like a second PhD. And the colleague said, it was like, actually your first book, it's always like your PhD structure. So it has, you know, your theory and your methodology and your empirical chapters. So when I made that decision, I'm like, you know what, I will still talk about, it's still relevant to talk about ideology and still relevant to draw that, okay, let's remind ourselves or not, right? Because in the end of the day, you start writing the theory and you're like, okay, will I find these elements when I actually look at the data? I haven't looked at the data. And actually I did. Yeah. So that's the reason I think it's like, it fascinated me as well, that actually there is this kind of consistency. But what changes again, it's how they frame it and they use it for the benefit. And I think here it's a very conscious flexibility, of course, gives them that kind of platform, but actually it's a very cautious, okay, I have 5 ingredients. How do you use, let's say 5, right? Yeah. How do I use that to make my case even stronger?
So I'm going to be very sort of UK-centric again, but when people are talking about, just the one I know the best, people talking about reform and saying it's, you know, it's, you know, people are pulled to them by dissatisfaction with different things and so on. But actually, no, there is an ideological core there, and yeah, I'm going to do something, if I may, slightly dangerous, because I can see that somebody I think you know, and the person who, when I was a master's student, taught me comparative politics, Daphne Halikopoulou, is watching, and I'm going to try to do the methodology bit, and I wanted to pick up one of the design things. You've got there's a lot going on because you've got time, country, and type of crisis.
Yeah.
So I've got I think there's 2 questions that I wanted to ask. One is, how do you balance all of that? How do you get the sort of robustness in that? I know you've got lots of parliamentary debates, you've got lots to look at, but it strikes me that there could be particular interactions there of, you know, the context of whatever was going on in 2007, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The other one, actually, I'll leave that with you, and then I'll come back to the second question.
Yeah. I think here it's just like, it's fine to say what I could do and what I couldn't do, right? Yes. And I think it's what I couldn't do. I think one of the stronger criticisms that I have towards myself in the book, it became a little bit more descriptive than I like. And I think it was the ambition about, and a little bit of a pressure to finish it, about maybe I had too much to chew or too many things to find. I think in terms of that, right? I had brilliant research assistants. First of all, I have to shout out, if anyone is watching, about assisting me, because it was a massive core of text that we had to do. Because again, I had this kind of idea, cross-country, cross-time, and cross-crisis. So of course it was like there was a lot of coding and cross-checking with all the coders throughout, and trying to apply as much as possible, not as much as possible, of course, try to apply the specific context in each country. Having said that, I think, again, in order to make a little bit coherent and easy to follow comparison, it became a little bit more descriptive, and of course it was like there are multiple data and multiple outputs for each country that I couldn't present as part of the book, especially because it was like there wasn't any space. Yeah. But then really you could have done it differently. I second that. I think it was like, but at that point, I think with the amount of data and be possible to have that kind of narrative and present an effective, it's just like, again, a comparative output. It was the only way to do that.
No, don't. Or
at least it's just like it's out there now.
Yeah, no, don't.
That kind of criticism.
I was going to say, don't knock the description. There, you know, when you've got the cases, you need to know what's going on.
Yeah.
You talk about the four crises we're looking at: Europe, Brexit, migration, COVID, and economic, so on. Are they actually separate crises, or is it just? Are we actually just in an age of crisis? Because we've, you know, it seems to be okay. What is it today? I think tomorrow was scheduled for a rain of frogs, but slightly more seriously, is does it matter that we're in this period where it's one thing after another? You've got a whole series of crises, and so maybe rather than the framing sort of reaching out as like, okay, this crisis, we are in an era of crisis, and it's which aspect of the polycrisis, I don't like that term, but you know what I mean, are we looking at?
Yeah, I think it's just like fortunately or fortunately, that's one of the reasons that we talk about crisis nowadays much more than we used to do actually. And there this kind of awareness to parties. I'm writing a paper about how the parties of populist parties see that. And actually, after 2020, after COVID, they actually have the narrative of permanent crisis or polycrisis themselves, which is fascinating. They are aware, not the populists, all the parties, right? Not just the populists. Sorry. So yeah, since 2008, let's say we see a crisis after crisis after crisis. In what you call polycrisis or what other people call permacrisis, just crisis is there, right? I do see a difference. At least it's just like because I see a difference, especially because a crisis, if we look at it as I said before, requires a solution in order to exit the crisis. So it's a pre-period pro-crisis, crisis after crisis. And we see this kind of different of effects in this kind of, very simplistically, we can split it in much more, right? Mm-hmm. But also when we form policy making, right? It's just like we try to form policies. If we look at policymakers dealing with crisis, they try to form policies that actually to prevent that as well. So that means that there is a pro-crisis period as well, that you might have actually, what kind of tools can you develop in order to have that in the before the crisis bursts, right? So because there is this kind of sequence, and actually in the period that we live, I don't know, I do expect the frogs to come tomorrow, maybe the day after, by the time they reach the Netherlands, that wave. But yeah, I see them separately because they have a very separate effect. At least I see them as a researcher, right? Because they have very different effect, and we can see just like, okay, exiting periods as well. So it's just like, and what happens in the meltdown as well after the crisis, that actually we see this kind of different kind of effects that it has in the political system. So I see them most definitely differently. The polycrisis effect, yeah, so it's just like it is a constant sequence of crises happening, and at the same time as well.
Yeah. I'm just going to pause there because we'll be wrapping up before too very much longer. Yeah. If anybody has any questions, do please put them, if you're in Zoom, on the chat or the Q&A. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, you could put them in the Q&A. I'm going to start picking up some of the questions that have come through, there's okay. So one from Rachel: if you were to extend the study beyond 2021, which emerging crises, climate change, energy prices, cost of living, do you think are most likely to reshape radical right discourse next?
After 2021, so I guess it doesn't.
Well, I suppose no. Actually, I think probably they meant like from today onwards.
Yeah. Well, I think the energy crisis has affected a lot, especially after the invasion in Ukraine. I think a very characteristic example, so that reflects to the, how to put it politely, just like the relationships that some radical right parties had with Russia. Put it lightly. So I think it's very interesting to see, not very interesting, a very characteristic example is to see how this narrative shifts in France, for instance. So how it affects and how to re-own the energy crisis, or it's just like that's happening, to also distance and reframe the party away from the relationship that it has. So it has the energy, but also we're talking about foreign policy here as well. With the invasion of Ukraine. So I think I would put you, actually, at least in Europe, the invasion of Ukraine had a quite effect in the parties that actually had, and there are quite a lot of parties that had quite strong relations with Russia.
Yeah. And you can understand the logic from what Russia is trying to do in terms of its foreign policy ambitions, but I think it also says a lot about where how Russia has changed. There's still people think of Russia in terms of communism or post-Soviet, and now we are looking, the politics they want to engage with. Partly it's just wanting to cause havoc, but they're quite happy. This is a sort of politics going back to the late 19th century, and it's something quite different, to what else. But also the far right parties see from Europe, see in Russia something that they can work with, and that they're happy to work with, even despite the problems there. And Ukraine, as you say, changes that. So, question I'll reframe this slightly. Another question. You're talking about crisis and policy responses. Is there a problem that sometimes policy responses are slow? It's like, I suppose what they're getting at is, can you announce we're going to go and do something, even if that takes a long time to have an effect, and challenge the narrative?
Well, I'm not a policy person, right? But if it's about policy, it's about structures, and it has to do a lot about, structures and institutions do not move very fast. Therefore, the response might be indeed slow, right? And one of the major things that when we talk about the crisis is actually how fast the response is on the crisis. I think that would be super interesting also. I really wanted to do that in the book, and I didn't. So it's like, how fast do you respond to that? In the policy making as well, right? So how can you see that? Effectively, I think COVID is a very good example about fast responses in policy making, but maybe because it included literally solutions that wasn't up to politicians, but actually doctors, labs. So, but 100%, right? And 100%, it's just like, because again, as I said, it has to do about legitimacy. So that if you are not effective in response to the crisis, you delegitimize, right? There's this kind of delegitimization that is happening, especially because of the policy and the slow policy making. And so there is a 100% connection there.
Thank you. Okay, and this is a related question. Could better management of from Alain, could better management of crises and perhaps better communications de-radicalize discourse?
Yeah, I think 100%, right? And
I think we're looking for some hope.
Yes. Hope I cannot offer. But again, it has to do about communication. It's part of crisis management, actually, and crisis exploitation. It's 100%. That's the reason I said before. It's competing narratives. And we see that, I was talking to a colleague, like, but of course they win. It's just like the radical right wins. So it's just like, but why are they winning in the narrative aspect of, because again, narrative means communicating. It's about the message. So it's very slippery. Rollers in the chair. So it has to do about that, right? So better communication and better, stronger message from the mainstream parties, the less radical parties, the established parties, it's going to be massively effective against the radicalization that the radical right parties offer.
I suppose that leads to a second question. Okay, at the moment, so you've got. So there's two possible sort of explanations there. One is that the not far right parties, the moderate parties, aren't very good at communications, which I think is true. But I think the other question is there something about something particular about the popular radical right that makes them particularly good at
communication?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think then I would refer to my PhD. As I said, it's just like I did political marketing and branding, that also part under political communication. I'm not going to refer to, it's not just about me, right? I think it's just like radical right, and there are many colleagues, lots of works out there, they're very effective on communication. And we see it just like it's a different kind of rhetoric. It's a different, when we talk about radical right and communication, it's just like it's a lot about rhetoric, it's a lot about leadership. It's a lot about media and how they have used that for the benefit. So in the communication part, for years we have said that actually there's something more advanced than other parties have. And here, of course, it's we cannot forget that actually, it's structural. It's the way the parties are formed. Largest parties, established parties. I don't know if we look at, big parties. of course, they have structures that are much more difficult to move, and this kind of mechanism within the party, where actually radical right parties have usually smaller. Here I'm still in the Netherlands, and it's one-person party. It's much smaller it's much easier to adapt and be flexible, especially because of the structures they have. Right, so it's just like, and that reflects on the effectiveness of actually being able to monitor and frame their message as well, connecting to the communication. Right, they're much easier for them to adapt and respond and reflect, if you like, than other parties. So there are multiple factors that actually affect that, like the structure, for instance.
That's, you know, that flexibility is really interesting. This is, again, you say you have like Geert Wilders or you know, Nigel Farage. I mean, going back a little bit, you had, I can't remember his name, the person who set up, Beppe Grillo, who set up Cinque Stelle. The established parties are, you know, big bureaucratic machines.
Yeah.
And you know that ability, because there's been quite a lot of criticism of again, reform's the case I'm familiar with, of reform for being list Nigel Farage, and the fact that it's a wholly owned company and so on. There's actually been some, from within reform, there's been some demands for democratisation, so that members have more, but that being able to be nimble, and I suppose that also may explain why you get, for you know, you get, say, a Zoran Madani in, I know that's from the States, or so yeah, but I mean, it's the case of the moment. It's the case of the moment.
I know, my name is Mamdani.
Oh, sorry, so, yeah, Mamdani. The not being tied to those traditional structures is actually a real advantage, and that.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and actually, one of the things that the sort of moderate or traditional whatever parties need to learn. I'm for my sins, I'm a member of the Labour Party. The Labour Party rule book is nearly 200 pages long.
Yeah.
And you know, maybe that's the problem here.
No, 100% right, and I think it's just we see that also. Of course, if you look a little bit more on the electoral manifestos, for instance, radical right parties, they started from a page. Now, because of course, the more they get more popular, the more they have to broaden a little bit their horizons on the issues that they're talking about. So the manifestos are still a little bit, you know, rather than 1 page, now it's 5 pages. But there is a massive difference when you look at the established parties, right? And if we want to take it back to the crisis itself, when you're a governing party, you have to provide solutions in order to exit the crisis, right? If we look, it's one of the findings of the book, right, as well. They don't offer solutions. You don't have to offer solutions. It's just like management. It's just like, just pinpointing about who is to be blamed and what the IBAN has, and maybe what we need to turn on again. And let's talk about your security and nationalism, security, nationalism. So it's very different than actually providing concrete solutions. And this is not what they're doing, right? Which is essential to understand. Also, it's just like, it doesn't mean that you have to provide solutions in order to be successful. This is, or have a successful message, specifically, because it's about communication.
And that's a big problem generally for anyone to deal with. That you can, it's. I mean, it's the classic thing of campaigning and governing are different things, and you know, if you just want to you know, raise this as an issue, you know, partly there can be a self-interested thing of you just want to be people to know who you are, and maybe you want to, you know, it's quite nice being a deputy or parliamentarian, and it also raises maybe, you know, you actually genuinely, you know, believe these things, and it keeps it as an issue and so on, and it's. Unfortunately, it seems to be effective. It seems to be working. I've been thinking this goes back. There's a line in Machiavelli where he talks about in The Prince about virtue and fortune, and he's using not virtue not as we use, but I think there's something there that it's seeing an opportunity and seizing it. Maybe that's what the radical right, far right are doing that makes them so successful. It's Yeah, I mean,
well, there is this, hopefully I'm going to do justice. I'm really sorry, it has been a very long day. There is this story that might or might not be true. And I'm really sorry, I'm going to most probably misstate it now, that Churchill, they assigned it to Churchill, that all crises need to be exploited or something. It's just like none of the crises need to be unexploited or something. So it's definitely that, right? About opportunities. If there is an opportunity, it's just like who is using it more effectively, right? And how do they, I don't know what effect, again, of whatever effect means, but it's always up for exploitation. Yeah.
So I think the phrase is, don't let a good crisis go to waste.
Yes, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Again, sorry for disclaimer, I had 3 meetings.
No, it's absolutely fine. I think we're up to an hour, so I think we will wrap up there. Anything else you want to mention at the end?
I think it's just like the only thing that actually this experience studying the crisis, right? I think it's just like it's super important. I see this kind of the opportunity that studying crisis offers is this kind of very interdisciplinary approach, you know, from policymakers, for public administration people, like that, even for conflict, or just like what the crisis means and the context of it means, that it offers a platform or politics of its own. So it's just like it's a politics of the crisis itself, rather than actually just looking at it as crisis management. All the opportunities that it offers from all the actors that are involved. Crisis is not just about policy making. So it plays a fundamental role that is quite on the side of political science. So I think it's just like, I think it requires more attention to look at that. And luckily there are lots of people picking it up, therefore, that. But no, I think it's a brilliant opportunity that you gave me in order to discuss my thoughts, and thank you so much for providing me the platform and being patient with me, misquoting Churchill or not.
No, not at all. This has been, fantastic. I can, from seeing people, I've got a little graph that shows me that people are staying to the end. Which is fantastic. Thank you ever so much. Congratulations on the book. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, David. It's just like, and also I do, for people that are watching, submit your abstracts. This is a brilliant conference. I have been going there as a PhD student when I was living in the UK. So do send your abstract for the conference, and Edinburgh is amazing.
Yes, and it's asen.ac.uk/conference. All of our social medias. Well, I think that's everything. Thank you all very much. And we will. We're trying to organise an event to coincide with International Migrants Day next month. Stay tuned for more information on that. Wherever you are, I hope you have a super rest of the day. Do take care. Thank you. Thanks, Billy.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Dave.